Hello, I'm joining you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I wish to thank the organisers of this conference. It's not an easy task to do. And finally, I have to apologise for James Levy, the co-presenter of this paper on social justice in the Peronist period in Argentina, because for family reasons he's had to go to the not so United States of America, but he shall be back later in July. All right, now this is in Buenos Aires. In 1954, Alfredo Palacios, a famous Socialist Party member and former federal senator, published La Justicia Social. In this work, which runs to over 500 tightly packed pages, Palacios traces the philosophical and historical background of social justice from ancient Israel and Greece through to the Rio de la Plata area and its development from before independence to 1943. In fact, the term social justice appears to have been coined by the Italian Jesuit Luigi Tapparelli in 1843, who argued that human beings should have rights to well-being. The word justice stems from an often unacknowledged injustice, while social recognises the reality of human group activities and the factors involved in the formation and continuance of groups. In 19th century Europe, the major group whose welfare was deficient was the working class associated families. Members of the capitalist class had wealth and income and recourse to a justice system based on individual rights. Workers did not. By 1900, in Europe and in European-oriented societies such as Argentina, there was widespread recognition that the class divide could threaten the capitalist mode of production and capitalist political control. In response to wretched working conditions, low pay, long hours of work, substandard housing and sanitation, poor health, lack of adequate nutrition, clothing and heating, and little in the way of protective insurance systems, including for the aged, females and children, various socialist and anarchist organisations call for the overthrow of capitalism. Many capitalists and their followers acknowledged the threat and realised reforms had to occur to alleviate the social problem, as it was often called. Tapparelli's term social justice was increasingly used by the reformers, who supported class collaboration and rejected the class warfare of Marxists and radical anarchists such as Proudhon. In place of the latter's property theft, reformers employed vague terms such as fairness. A fair day's work or a fair day's pay is a good example of this. Today in Australia, fair may have been replaced by the pub test. The reformers agreed on class collaboration and class harmony. They consisted of some socialists, labour rights, unionists, Christians, capitalists, politicians and professionals. In Great Britain by the early 20th century, the social justice mantra had been embraced by Fabian socialists and even such liberals as David Lloyd George. The Catholic Church, still rooted in pre-capitalist notions of social order, specifically European feudalism, recognised the need to come to terms with the modernity and at least address the issue of human deprivation engendered by capitalism. Leo XIII's 1891 encyclical Rerum Novarum, while not using the term social justice, preached the importance of improving the lives of workers. Reformers posited a number of ways to improve working lives. One, charity, these days philanthropy. The link of this to social justice is tentative at best, as charity does not necessarily involve either justice or social. Mind you, the phrase giving back to the community does suggest some sort of reparative justice for a theft, but that's not made explicit. 2. Government action by means of labour and other reforms such as the provision of adequate housing, healthcare, pensions, arbitration systems and the like. 3. The encouragement of workers to develop their own mechanism for ensuring the good life, such as mutual aid societies. Globally, the social justice movement was boosted in 1919 by the formation of the International Labour Organization, made up by national representatives of labour, capitalists and governments, and whose constitution based itself on the social justice principle. And in 1931, Pope Pius XI released the Quadragesimo Anno, which advocated strongly and explicitly for social justice as a necessary element in the maintenance of class harmony and peace. In Argentina, rapid capitalist development from the 1870s based on economic liberal principles resulted in a replication of the urban and rural problems that had been so evident in Europe by the middle of the 19th century. Pandemics and overcrowding in the cities, along with limited access to sanitation and potable water and high rents in comparison to wages, as well as unhealthy working conditions, resulted in many workers turning to anarchism and syndicalism and the formation of mutual aid societies to perhaps provide for illness, unemployment, funerals, and even housing finance. According to Pablo Bartolomé Nascimento, in 1916, there were 1,124 such societies throughout Argentina, with most concentrated in the province of Buenos Aires, the federal capital, and the province of Santa Fe. Argentine governments generally adhered to laissez-faire principles, and their first response to worker unrest was usually repression, reaching its peak in the Semana Trágica of 1919, when between 100 and 1,500 workers were killed, and the Patagonian Revolt of 1920 to 22, when 300 to 1,500 workers lost their lives. However, governments also responded to the obvious plight of the workers and did attempt to regulate some aspects of the capitalist-worker relationships, such as working hours and work injuries. But the federalist structure of the Argentine political system impeded universal change, even had authorities possessed the will for reform. A few workers in particular industries, especially the railway workers, did gain pension funds, but contributions came from workers and employers, not from the state, unless they were state funds. Similarly, women workers gained a maternity fund in 1934, which they paid them for 30 days prepartum and 45 days postpartum. Women workers paid the contributions to the funds. Charity organisations, usually church-based, were many. In most cases, the state subsidised these by means of yearly grants. Some prominent Catholics in and out of government sought to improve housing, but gains were few. The turn towards economic liberalism, the turn against economic liberalism in the 1930s and its obvious failure to provide adequate living standards for the bulk of the population resulted in pleas for greater and more coordinated state action. In the province of Santa Fe, the anti-personalist radical administrations from 1939 to 1943 created the first Ministry of Public Health and Labour in Argentina, and also a fund of social assistance for the aged, the invalided, for mothers and for orphans. Joaquin Argons, governor of Santa Fe from 1941 to 1943, championed the concept of social justice, which he says was an innate right for those living in misery and want. Charity and the alleviation of misery so as to avoid threats to the establishment were not sufficient. Argons attributed his conversion to social justice to the French Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain, who visited Argentina in 1936. The May Revolution of 1943 led to the appointment of Juan Domingo Perón, the head of newly created Secretariat of Labour and Welfare in November 1943. Rapidly, Perón adopted social justice as the philosophy of the organisation, and subsequently as one of the three essential elements of his movement, along with economic independence and political sovereignty. As far as we are aware, no government, apart from Perón's, has put so great an emphasis on social justice. An important element of Perón's social justice was the extension of democracy by means of females getting the vote, and the establishment of a female Peronist party. As in 1946, when male workers entered Congress in numbers for the first time, many women gained congressional representation in 1952. Similarly, the composition of elective representatives changed in the provinces and municipalities. Citizens who had been marginalised in the past were now more cognizant of their rights, more politically active, and more aware of the duty of government to provide for them when necessary. In 1952, which was the centenary of the death of the Argentine independence hero General San Martin, the government released an 806-page, richly illustrated propaganda work about what had been achieved since Perón became head of the Secretariat of Work and Welfare. Many of the issues it covered included before and after pictures, as in the pages on the rights of the aged. Before is misery, after is dignity and well-being. This volume as in many of Perón's speeches, emphasizes the differences between charity and aid. Initially, Perón postulated that well-being could be achieved by mutual aid organisations, insurance funds, and welfare state activities. The British Beveridge Plan formed the basis of many of the recommendations in the first 5-year plan, which ran from 1947 to 1951. Charity would not be necessary in the new Argentina, and in fact was demeaning. The needs of many Argentines, however, required immediate assistance. This was mainly done via the Eva Perón Foundation, though there was also a government agency to support the marginalised. Not charity, but ayuda social or asistencia social, which operated in tandem with social justice organisations and programs. Perón was always very clear that his was not a socialist program. He attacked the liberal landholding oligarchy, but he did not attempt to nationalise the basis of their wealth and power, the land. As with the Catholic Church, he promoted class harmony. His was the third way between capitalism and socialism. The Peronist coat of arms represents the inequality of classes. If we look first at the Argentine coat of arms that you can see on the slide, you can see two hands and arms reaching out to shake hands around the pike, which represented the determination to fight for liberty. This was from the independence period. But you can see that the arms are on the same level. And this represents that the provinces are all equal. They come together, the united provinces. Now, if you look at the Peronist coat of arms, you can see here that the arms and hands are not on an equal level. And this is because Perón quite clearly recognises that there are class differences in Argentina and that he stands to maintain the classes, the capitalist class and the working class. But in his Argentina, in the new Argentina, one hand from above is helping the hand from below. They are united in one. This is class harmony, and it is each helping the other. There's also this representation that we find on some Peronist banners from the early 1950s. And here the hand below is black. Now, at that time in Argentina, there was not that much of a Afro-American population, unlike at the times of independence. So the blackness of the hand below and the arm below may be a nod towards the cabecitas negras, the little blackheads. The well-to-do people of Buenos Aires used to slur Peronist supporters as the little blackheads. These are people from the countryside, their skins were darker, they weren't Europeans like the good people of Buenos Aires. So this may be Peronists saying, well, yes, there may be little blackheads, but, you know, we're all united and we all work together for the common good. So what Perón's social justice was about fewer rich and fewer poor. So conditions of life for the Argentine people, for the masses of the Argentine people, should be improved. That they were before they were at a very low ebb in the 1930s and always before that. But with Peronism, then there is going to be greater equality, but not absolute equality, certainly not. And so, for instance, one of the things that we see him doing very early on in his period of work and welfare was to put out the Statute of the Peon in 1944, which went some way towards protecting peons from the worst aspects of the exploitation they suffered on the farms in Argentina. So, for instance, bosses had to supply them with raincoats when it rained. Once again, here from this propaganda work of Perón's, we have the before and after. Before is misery, after is dignity and well-being. Now, how much of this is propaganda? How much of it is reality? Well, if we look at average real urban rates between 1939 and 1956, then we see that there's a massive increase in the average real wage and salary rate from about 1946. So a massive increase in income for workers. And of course, because they're getting more income, and we're talking about a real wage here, this is making allowances for inflation, then workers have got a lot more money to spend on things like holidays and utensils for the house and furniture and housing and all of these sorts of things, entertainments, particularly holidays. This was a big period in which the Peronists propagated the view that people should be going on holidays. And so many, many children, for example, in the interior provinces were taken to the beaches to enjoy that sort of activity. Now, as well as that, you can see the real wage increases. And because there's a real wage increases, as you would expect, then it means there's a shift in the proportional share of the surplus that's produced that goes to the working class. So before 1947, then the capitalists were getting well above 50% of the surplus. But from about 1947, then the workers' share increases, so that by 1954, they're getting about 58% of the surplus. So there's a greater share going to the working class, which is in lines with social justice philosophy of fewer rich, fewer poor, of people should be living dignified existences. Now, there was also, if we take housing, then there's a massive increase in housing during the Peronist period. And this is principally due to the policy of allowing, or directing, in fact, the Banco Hipotecario Nacional, the national mortgage bank, to fund housing of workers and salary earners who make applications to it for home loans. So there's a massive period in this, massive period of these home loans released to people in this period. And there's also a considerable investment in social housing by various provinces and by the central national government. And the Eva Peron Foundation also builds a considerable number of houses. So housing supply is much increased. There was also a rent freeze imposed shortly after the May Revolution of 43, and those rent freezes continued through this period and well into the 1960s, in fact. If we look at health, then once again, we see a massive increase in the number of health establishments, particularly at the level of the provinces, and also a doubling of the number of beds in hospitals available to people. And so we see the health of Argentines in general improve through this period, although there was not the establishment of a universal health system or insurance system, despite the efforts of the Minister of Public Health, Ramon Carrillo. Now, if we look at what happens in the various areas, we're looking at pensions, the superannuation systems, the funds, right through to health and housing and these sorts of things. And what we see is that there's not a great shift in the sorts of policies that are followed in the Peron period as compared to those before it. However, what we do see is an enormous increase in the quantity of the benefits obtained. So the number of workers covered by pension schemes increases greatly. Similarly, if you're looking at health, and the number of beds available to people in hospitals increases, and the number of health institutions, facilities also increases. In education, there's a huge increase in technical education. So what we can do is, with all of these things, we can provide the proof that these sorts of benefits all increased. And so, in terms of social justice, then the claim of the Peronists and of Peron that people gained enormously in this period is true. Now, just going back to 1954 and Alfredo Palacios, where we began this talk, notice that he ends in 1943, and this book is published in 1954. So he's not going to acknowledge anything that happens after 1943. He's very keen on talking about the sorts of reforms that he got through Congress before that, but he's not going to acknowledge Peronism at all. And I think this is one of the great injustices that we see in Argentine history, is that with the overthrow of Peron in 1955 by the military, then they attempt to write this whole period out of Argentine history. is referred to, they refer to it as a dictatorship. They refer to it as just based on propaganda. They say that the working class and the marginalised were bought easily by the Peronists, and that they just swallowed Peronist doctrine. They were misled. However, you know, one of the things that was definitely achieved in the period was the allegiance of the majority of the Peronist, of Argentine voters to Peronism. And so the Peronist Party was outlawed until the early 1970s. And throughout that time, though, people maintained their allegiance to Peronism. So let's leave it there. Evita lives still, and still today we have this push in Argentina on the part of many Peronists to go back to the golden period of the first Peronist administrations. Thank you.